Well, good morning, First Baptist Oakboro family and friends. I am so glad to digitally see you today. I wish I could lay my physical eyes on you. I'm so looking forward to that day, but for now we are just thrilled with the fact that we can meet this way at the very least. I am Pastor Jonathan. I had the great privilege of serving here at First Baptist Oakboro, and I got to tell you, this is an incredible group of people. This is a people with whom you can connect to grow in Christ and reach out for His kingdom. If you don't have a place that you are connecting in this difficult season, let me invite you to connect here with us. There are all kinds of ways for you to do that, from this format to Zoom Sunday school groups and the like. In this season when we can all use just a little bit more connecting with other people than perhaps we're getting, we are a place, a people with whom you can do that. I got a question this morning for you as we get into our reflection on the scriptures together, and it's this. How many of you watching remember where you were on January 28th, 1986? I'll confess that I was 4, and I don't really remember very much in any kind of detail prior to about my 5th birthday. It was at the zoo. It was a good time. So I don't, but I suspect that some of you who are not really all that much older than I am do remember. I bet you remember very, very clearly where you were. If you were school age, I bet you even remember where you were sitting on that day. And just to prove my point, what is it that happened on that day? Some of you knew the answer to that immediately, right? Just before noon, local time, a space shuttle called the Challenger launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Now, while that's always exciting, this launch really was special because it was the first of the now infamous Teacher in Space program. Krista McAuliffe, a history and English teacher from New Hampshire, had been selected from a pool of more than 11,000 applicants in 1985, and here, just a few months later, she was making her space debut. But the excitement buzzing throughout the country over this teacher going to space quickly turned to shock and then horror. As 73 seconds into the launch, the Challenger exploded in a ball of fire, killing McAuliffe and all 6 other crew members aboard. After a period of national mourning, people began to demand answers. They wanted to know how this could have happened. President Reagan quickly assembled a group of experts to investigate. It became known as the Rogers Commission after its chair, William P. Rogers, a former U.S. Attorney General under Eisenhower and Secretary of State under Nixon, someone everyone looked up to as a steady, calm, expert voice to lead this group. What the Rogers Commission discovered was that, after a lengthy investigation, was that the explosion was caused by a faulty O-ring. The O-rings were these rubber seals that were supposed to protect the solid fuels in the rocket's main boosters from the superheated gases on the outside. Well, due to a design flaw that had occurred almost 10 years before, the O-rings in use by NASA at the time tended to lose a bit of their structural integrity in low temperature environments, like those, say, of a late January morning, resulting ultimately in an ineffective seal. The final result is that while the faulty seals had been used without incident for years, on this particular occasion, the conditions were just right for them to fail. As a result, the rocket launched, and when the gases on the outside of the rocket heated to a sufficiently high temperature, they bypassed the O-ring seals, igniting the solid fuels in the main booster. And the rest is history. Now, while we could certainly shift the blame here around all kinds of different places, and indeed that's what often happens in the wake of a big national tragedy, as to a certain extent we are seeing right now, in the final analysis, it was a small error in judgment in 1977 that blew up, literally, in the faces of those who made it almost 10 years later. Now, when we don't do things that are right, there are always consequences. Sometimes those consequences may not manifest themselves until much later even, but they eventually always do come to light. The Challenger disaster played this out on a particularly large and public scale, but more often than not, it comes in an entirely smaller, more intimate package: our lives. The reason for this has its foundation all the way back in the beginning of humanity, in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve rebelled against God in the Garden of Eden by eating fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which he had specifically told them not to eat from. Well, one of the things that lies at the heart of what they did was their intention to try and do life on their own. They wanted, because Satan had convinced them to want it, to be like God by knowing what he knows. They had forgotten, of course, that they were already more like God than any other created thing, because they were the only ones created in his image. But then that's how Satan works. He convinces us to want something that we already have and to put our desire for that thing above our desire for God. In any event, they wanted to do life on their own. Still today, the heart of our rebellion against God is that we want to do life on our own. We try to do it all the time. We try it in 1,000 different ways. Without exception, though, every single one of these attempts ends in failure. But the real problem here is that we don't always or even often see that failure until it's too late. Because of this, we keep right on going it alone in life, blissfully, or perhaps not so blissfully, unaware of the shoe that's just waiting to drop. Fortunately, the scriptures have some good reminders for us that going it alone when it comes to our relationship with God, it's not a neutral proposition. It's not something we can kind of, take or leave depending on how we feel in a given moment. It's something that's central to who we are as followers of Jesus. If we leave this behind, we leave behind our only abiding source of life. Well, just like disconnecting from your shuttle base when doing a spacewalk will result in you drifting hopelessly out into space, disconnecting from your source of life in this world is always going to end in disaster. But still, that disaster usually comes slowly enough that in any given moment, we don't really believe it's coming. Thus, we need these scriptural reminders that this particular path is never going to end well for us. Well, one of the very best of these is found in the narrative of what happened to the people of Israel after Joshua, Moses' successor, died. It's called the book of Judges. And for the next few weeks in a new teaching series called Going It Alone, we're going to take a look together at this just gripping set of stories about a group of people trying to do just that. In order to get into a book like Judges, though, we need some background. We need some background and also a framework to give us a context for understanding what it is we're going to see. The book of Judges describes a period of Israel's history between the initial settling of the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, and the beginning of a series of monarchies that would ultimately end in the invasion and destruction by Assyria and Babylon. Now, keep in mind, when we get to this beginning point in Israel's history, while they had been free from Egypt's rule for about 2 generations, they still didn't know how to be a free nation. As you read through the story in Genesis, Exodus, specifically Exodus through Deuteronomy, you see that God was very much holding their hand the whole time. He gave them strong leaders like Moses and Joshua. Through Moses, he gave the people a law that outlined pretty clearly what it looked like to be a free people after the image that he was casting for them. Through Joshua, he led them militarily in conquering and driving out the people groups already living in the land that was going to be their new homeland, so that their new homeland was free from enemies who wanted to do them harm both externally and internally. Now, just as a quick aside here, note on reality, if you will, not a few folks struggle with this part of the Bible. In fact, I'd say that more folks struggle with this series of stories than just about any other part of the scriptures. And the reason for this is simple. The thought of one nation aggressively taking land from another and killing most of its inhabitants in the process sounds awful to us. Nations don't do that anymore, do they? Sort of. But this type of territorial expansion, aggressive territorial expansion, is part of what sparked World War II. if we're going to make any sense out of this at all, there are three things we've got to keep in mind. The first is this: we have to get God's character right. The God revealed in the pages of Scripture is 100% loving and 100% just. He always does what is right, and his right doing is always heavily tempered with love. If we come across then something in the Scriptures that seems to paint God in a different light than this, the most rational conclusion, listen, is that either we are getting something wrong in how we are reading it, or we've misunderstood it some way. Not that God has character problems, or even that there's something wrong with the text itself. That should be a baseline assumption for how we approach all of our engagement with the Scriptures, but it applies particularly importantly right here. Number two, the people living in the land of Canaan when the Israelites arrived were not merely innocent victims to the Israelites' aggressive brutality. No, they were unbelievably evil in their own right. They were okay with things like child sacrifice and practiced it often. They regularly used and abused women and men in all kinds of awful ways. They were brutal with one another and with themselves. They were incredibly unjust in all their dealings. What's more, they'd been like that for a really long time. God had declared to Abraham more than 400 years prior to this that the people of Canaan were going to be judged. This was in the context of him telling Abraham that he was going to give their land to his descendants. But because he's a God of mercy, he was not going to judge them right then. He was going to give them more time so that they had a chance to turn their lives around and get back on the right track. If anything, by more time, God meant nearly 400 years. I'd say he let them go a little too long, wouldn't you? And that he happened to use Israel to bring about this judgment says nothing about them at all. He makes that clear. Instead, it's a reminder of the fact that God uses whoever he wills to accomplish his purposes of mercy and justice. He would later use Assyria and Babylon to bring justice to Israel for their many, many sins, just like Israel was being used here to bring justice to the people of Canaan. In this case, the people of Canaan had been shown mercy for more than 400 years, and they were now facing justice for their many, many sins. Number three, this kind of warfare that we see here in Joshua and Judges was entirely commonplace back then, and no one would have thought it at all morally problematic. Here's why that matters. We need to be careful in reading our moral assumptions back on them. We know a great deal more about God and his ways now than they did then. We recognize all kinds of things that they did were not necessarily good to do. But sometimes God works in peoples and cultures where they are in order to bring them just a step or two forward, rather than expecting them to suddenly miraculously behave like people hundreds of years removed from them, morally speaking. Now, yes, this looks awful to later peoples like us who understand him better, but it's a testament to the patience of our God in bringing us from where we are to where he wants us to be. He knows that we can't get there all at once, and so he's patient. He takes us just a step at a time. Rest assured, should our Lord tarry, we wouldn't want people living 4,500 years from now to judge us on the basis of their understanding of God. That wouldn't be just. And so God doesn't judge that way. Let's get back on track. God had done all of this different hand-holding for the people, ultimately to get them to where they were now, preparing to move into the land that he had been promising them for nearly half a millennium. But have you ever tried to hold a child's hand who didn't want his hand to be held? In one of our trips to Kansas City to visit my folks, we happened to stop by a Target on a given day. Actually, given that we live so far from a Target where we are right now, when we go to Kansas City and there's one, 2 minutes from my folks' house, we go often, like every day, which is probably why those trips are so expensive. In any event, our youngest, Micah, and I were the last out of the van on this particular outing. By the time we got out, I'd gotten him unbuckled, gotten him out, he started to walk in, he didn't want to be carried, he wanted to walk. My folks, Mimi and Grandpa, were already almost to the door to the store. Well, by the time Mike and I got to the road separating the parking lot from the store entrance, he was doing everything he could to pull his little hand out of mine and yelling and screaming at me the whole time. He had no interest in being walked across the street. He wanted to get to where his grandparents were. He wanted to run on up ahead and had no thought of anything else, least of all the possible consequences of this little guy taking off across a parking lot unattended. Well, God's hand-holding with the people of Israel got them successfully into the land, but once there, they let go. Then things started to go downhill quickly. It mostly started when Joshua died. If you have a copy of the scriptures nearby, find your way to Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2, and check this out with me, starting at verse 6. Previously, when Joshua had sent the people away, the Israelites had gone to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. The people worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua. They had seen all the Lord's great works he had done for Israel. Joshua the son of Nun died, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. In other words, as long as Joshua, or somebody who was alive when Joshua was alive, the people still clung to God's hand. But those folks didn't live forever. Eventually, they died. And it became clear that while they had served very effectively to keep the people on the right track with their leadership and their stories, the power of their stories, they were not so successful when it came to actually passing their faith on to the next generation. Look at verse 10 now. That whole generation was also gathered to their ancestors. After them, another generation rose who did not know the Lord or the works that he had done for Israel. And for my Bible scholars who are tuned in right now, that verse may sound kind of like another verse that comes a little earlier in the scriptures. Way back at the end of Genesis, Joseph, son of Jacob, who was the grandson of Abraham, goes on this wild journey of his own to become second in command over all of Egypt. During his tenure then, Jacob, his father, and his whole family, 72 of them in all, moved down to Egypt where they flourished in the land that Pharaoh provided for them. But eventually Joseph died, and we get this from Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. A new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. What comes next is nearly 400 years of misery for the people. The very misery, in fact, that God's rescuing them from had led them to where they were now. Well, after verse 10 of Judges chapter 2 here, comes a long period of history when for the people of Israel that did not go well for them. They forgot. They forgot who the Lord was and what he had done for them. They forgot how he had called them to live. They forgot the advice, commands really, he had given them to help them live along those lines. Now, you couldn't tell this happened at first. Memories sometimes take a few years to drain away. Indeed, if you jump back to the very beginning of Judges, which serves as kind of a summary before you get a restatement of some things, which is where we were just reading, back at the beginning of Judges, we find this. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who will be the first to fight for us against the Canaanites? So here, it looks like things are going to continue just like they were when Joshua was alive. The people were going to continue to conquer the land and take over the inheritance that God had for them. The tribe of Judah got the nod. And so the text says that they team up with Simeon to continue the task of clearing out the Canaanite people still remaining in the land that had been given them. The next several verses detail this happening. But then in verse 19, we get this interesting little note. The Lord was with Judah and enabled them to take possession of the hill country. But they could not drive out the people who were living in the valley, because those people had iron chariots. So what's that mean? Well, at the time, not very much. Judah had gotten some land to call their own, which is what God wanted them to do, but they weren't able to secure all of it. They got the hills, couldn't get the plains. Seemingly no big deal. Now, sure, there was the thing God said the one time about driving the people completely out of the land. If Judah had enough land to spread out and live comfortably, what would it matter if they didn't quite follow all of God's commands? One time does not a pattern make. But you see, that's just it. It wasn't just one time. After verse 19, we find verse 21. At the same time, the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. The Jebusites have lived among the Benjaminites in Jerusalem to this day, whenever the author here was writing. Okay, but that's just 2 tribes out of 12. I mean, surely the others fared better, didn't they? Yeah, not so much. The tribe of Joseph went to try to take Bethel, couldn't do it, got the help from somebody on the inside who betrayed this city with the promise that they would let him live, and then he went and built another city in his own image, not God's, that remained in the land. Then we get this whole succession of slips, starting at verse 27. At that time, Manasseh failed to take possession of Bethshean and Tanakh and their surrounding villages, or the residents of Dor, Ibleam, and Megiddo and their surrounding villages. The Canaanites were determined to stay in the land, you think? When Israel became stronger, they made the Canaanites serve as forced labor, but never drove them out completely. At that same time, Ephraim failed to drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, so the Canaanites have lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun failed to drive out the residents of Kitron or the residents of Nahalol, so the Canaanites lived among them and served as forced labor. Asher failed to drive out the residents of Akko or of Sidon or Ahlab, Aksib, Helba, Aphik, and Rehob. And yes, those are as hard to type as they are to pronounce. The Asherites lived among the Canaanites who were living in the land because they failed to drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the residents of Beth Shemesh or the residents of Beth Anath. They lived among the Canaanites who were living in the land, but the residents of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath served as their forced labor. The Amorites forced the Danites into the hill country and did not allow them to go down into the valley. The Amorites were determined to stay in Har Heres, Aijalon, and Shalbim. When the house of Joseph got the upper hand, the Amorites were made to serve as forced labor. So then what is all this beyond a litany of hard-to-pronounce names, the kind of list that just makes you want to cross your eyes and stop listening? Well, you remember that failure of Judah and Benjamin with Simeon that we looked at just a bit ago? Yeah, it went beyond just them. Every single one of the tribes failed to do what God had commanded them to do. I mean, sure, they conquered the peoples of the land. God promised them he would help them do that. But enslaving them wasn't God's command. God's command was clear back in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 2. He said this, "And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you and you defeat them, you must completely destroy them. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy." Now, again, we can talk about the difficulties inherent in that text another time, but God gives us a pretty specific reason for this command a couple of verses later. Check this out. "Because they will turn your sons away from me to worship other gods. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you. He will swiftly destroy you." In other words, if you don't get rid of these guys and their influence in its entirety, you're going to regret it. It's going to come back to bite you in the tail. Well, the people did exactly what God told them they should not do. They conquered, but did not destroy. They did not remove. They did not cleanse the land of the evil influence of these folks whose land God had given to Israel in part as a judgment for their grievous and incorrigible sins. Remember that generation who rose up and did not know the Lord or the works that he'd done for Israel? The children of those folks didn't follow God's commands to completely destroy the Canaanites and to entirely exterminate their influence from the land. Guess what happened with them? Flip over to Judges chapter 2, verse 11. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshiped the Baals and abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed other gods from the surrounding peoples and bowed down to them. They angered the Lord. They abandoned him and worshipped Baal and the Ashtoreths. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he handed them over to marauders who raided them. He sold them to the enemies around them, and they could no longer resist their enemies. Whenever the Israelites went out for war, the Lord was against them and brought disaster on them, just as he had promised and sworn to them. So they suffered greatly. In other words, they insisted on going it alone, and as a result, they paid the price for it. God told them what would happen if they didn't do what he said. They didn't do what he said, and all the bad things he said would happen, happened. And so began a pattern that would last somewhere between 200 and 400 years, during which time the people would try again and again to go it alone. God would allow them to face the consequences of their decision. They would come to their senses and cry out to him for help. He would take pity on them because of his great mercy and love for them and rescue them. And then once everything settled down, they would depart from God and try to go it alone again. Each time they would leave the boundaries of their relationship with God, they would go a little further afield. And each time that they returned to his gracious arms, they wouldn't come back quite as closely as they'd been before. Eventually, their turning and going it alone bore bitter fruit. It bore bitter fruit whose seeds would fall and germinate and eventually grow roots that would poison the land. So God finally had enough and had to use another nation to do to them what he had used them to do to the Canaanites. And while there are perhaps many lessons to be drawn from all of this, and we're going to see many more as we work through this over the next few weeks, there's one that stands out clearly at this point in the story. Disobedience always has consequences. Disobedience always has consequences, always. Now, sometimes those consequences may seem very far removed, but they'll always come. This is what happened in the Challenger disaster. One error in judgment, one attempt to go it alone, if you will, led to another, then another, then another, and then another until the payment finally came due. This is what the people of Israel found. They did not entirely remove the influence of the Canaanites from their midst, and so just as the Lord had said, it eventually poisoned their hearts. They tried to go it alone. It was too hard to do what the Lord commanded anyway. They got to a place of stability, one of those respites along the way that God gives us when we need to recover our strength before the next leg of the journey. And then instead of moving forward again after a time, they just settled in and called it home. As we've traveled over the years to visit family on the road, occasionally we have to stop for bathroom breaks. Perhaps you know what I mean. Sometimes the easiest place to stop is at a rest area. Well, as we've stopped at various rest areas, we've found that some of them can be really nice. In addition to nice restrooms, clean restrooms, they've got well-equipped snack zones, plenty of space, grassy areas to run and play. We even stopped at one time that had a Vietnam War memorial there right on the grounds. It was just incredible. Well, whenever we stop at these, we get the few things we need, we recharge our batteries a bit, and then we hit the road more rested and ready to continue on than we were when we stopped. But what if we arrived at some particular rest area, decided we liked it, and then refused to leave? What would you say then? That'd be crazy, right? Do we even need to make a list of all the things that are wrong with that? We wouldn't have access to the nourishment that we needed because those snack machines, while equipped, weren't equipped with the kind of stuff to keep you healthy. There wouldn't be anywhere good to sleep. We would be separated from the community that we needed to sustain us. We'd be forever short of our intended destination and all the joys that held for us, and on the list goes. Our command, if you will, on those trips is the destination that we're aiming toward. Disobedience would have consequences. Well, disobedience always has consequences. So it goes with our lives. God has set you on a path. Some of you know what that is in a fair amount of detail. For others, it's a bit hazier. But whether the specific destination is clear, the character expectations for the journey are crystal clear. And character created by faithfulness is what will get you where you want to go. If you disobey these commands, though, even in ways that seem entirely insignificant at the time, there will be consequences. Disobedience always has consequences. But, and here's the good news, so does obedience. What's more, because of the gracious spirit of our God, the good consequences tend to come much faster and can even erase the consequences of disobedience before they have a chance to take root. So choose obedience. Disobedience always has consequences. They may not come quickly, but they will come. It may be that they don't really fully manifest themselves until your kids or grandkids are stuck having to pay the price. And why would you want to do that to them? Over the next few weeks, we'll see how this played out for Israel. Let's learn their lesson then, so that we don't have to experience it for ourselves. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for this example that you've given us in Israel's history. Preserved for us in our Bibles. Help us pay attention and learn through them, not like them. Help us remember that your words, your ways lead us to life, and commit ourselves to those with a spirit of obedience. Shape us in that in this season so that we come to reflect you more out of it than we have going into it. We ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.